Welcome to our first podcast in 2025, and what a better way to start the new year than touching on the updates to the transport and highway section in the NPPF, which, as many of you will know, was released in December 2024, 4 weeks old. I will be your host. My name is Amer Halabi, and hopefully you will enjoy this run through of the key issues and changes that's made in the NPPF. Our team has identified 5 key changes, and the first I hope you're familiar with is the introduction of the vision-led approach. Now, I suspect this is going to be the subject to really numerous discussions about what is a vision-led approach and, more importantly, who decides. And then the word vision-led, it filters through to 20 other paragraphs. So in paragraph 115D, it talks about cost-effective mitigation should be done through a vision-led approach. Transport assessments and transport statements under paragraph 118, which is really for developments that generate significant amounts of movement, should be vision-led. So to borrow the phrase that's been used so many times previously, vision-led seems to be the golden thread running through the transport considerations and the transport section. There are a few more changes. So in paragraph 115A, previously 114A, appropriate opportunities to promote sustainable transport has now been replaced with sustainable transport modes are prioritized, taking into account the vision, again, for the site, the type of development, and its location. In paragraph 116, previously was 115, the severe test has been retained, but explicit mention is now mentioned to mitigation, and it only applies taking into account all reasonable future scenarios. So this is part of the vision-led and the analysis methodology of the TA and the TS. So the debate is whether there will actually be any material difference from previously to now. Is there any really? Well, we'll see what it means in practice as we go along. Finally, there are 2 small changes, but they're quite important really. Is the chapter explicitly requires transport considerations to be an important part of early engagements with the local authorities and the local communities, and that's under paragraph 119A. That's a new paragraph. I think we're all familiar with consultations and public community consultations, where any new developments, the first comment that comes up is parking impact, traffic impact, bringing the traffic network to standstill, what happens at school hours, etc., etc. So it's an important issue for local communities, councillors, parish councils, highway officers, and so on. The vision-led transport statements in paragraph 118, previously 117, it must show how impacts are to be assessed, but also measured. That's a new one. On that theme, I think that's emerging from this vision-led approach is that there's going to be some rather interesting discussions on how these are to be monitored. So how are you going to measure? How are you going to monitor it? How these vision-led programs are going to be monitored. Now, before we start this new section, let me just share with you a little bit on the previous approach, which was called the predict and provide. Now, predict and provide, in broad terms, it was looking at the development, looking at the historical analysis and criteria to determine the trips generated by a development. They will go onto the highway network, and therefore we need to provide capacity for those new networks. Sorry, for those new trips. The decide and provide approach is different. It's really deciding on a preferred vision for a future, for the development, and then providing the means to work towards those vision, my apologies, and how we're going to achieve them and make them happen. Now, that offers more of an opportunity to have positive discussions with transport planning, with officers, with consultees, to try to provide a hierarchy where we start with walking, cycle, and public transport, enabling those, as opposed to just saying, well, let's provide more capacity for car travel. So what is a vision-led approach? Well, thankfully, the NPPF have provided some guidance in the glossary. If you haven't read it, here is some text I will read for yourselves. It says a vision-led approach is an approach to transport planning based on setting outcomes for the development based on achieving well-designed, sustainable and popular places and providing the transport solutions to deliver these outcomes, as opposed to predicting future demand to provide capacity, which is what we often refer to as the predict and provide, which I shared with you a bit earlier on. So we know there's going to be no changes under paragraph 77 for large-scale developments to provide more than a genuine choice of transport. Similarly, under paragraph 77, it retains instructions that there should not be an unrealistic level of self-containment. So it strikes me as that there is going to be obviously a vision-led approach that doesn't necessarily dictate a particular outcome. And perhaps one of the things that will develop over time is who decides what the vision should encompass. So in contrast to predict and provide, a vision-led approach has been categorized as the industry decide and provide. Obviously, there's going to be some thoughts about what sort of transport arrangements we want. So we think, and obviously at this early stage, this is speculative, we think the process is going to look something like this. You're going to have a set for outcomes that achieves well-designed, sustainable and popular places. Now, that's probably going to be done in concert with the local planning authority, LPAs, but it's not entirely clear whether or not they have a veto over whether or not a particular outcome meets that definition of well-designed, sustainable and popular places. Now, from that, we shortlist the transport solutions that meet the outcomes. And then we need to test against a range of scenarios. And remember what we said about this being a durable proposal, which is measured and monitored. You will need to test that scenario saying, will it still work if there is an economic downturn? Will it still work if there's a greater behavior change? So, for example, young people spending their times on their mobiles, would they be using more public transport so they are not separated from their phones? Food for thought. Will your proposed transport solutions work if that scenario carries on? In the downturn, we know what happens during COVID because the improvements in Wi-Fi connections and the quality of phones and so on. Will it work with the aspirations regarding net zero and charging points and all the other aspirations that come from the government guidelines? Once we've done all that testing, we decide on the transport solution. But does that leave some questions? Well, there's some. Are all vision-led approaches equal? Will the local planning authority be able to impose its own ideas of outcomes? How many scenarios will be tested? Now, presumably they'll come up with something like reasonable number of scenarios. What's reasonable? How will this vision-led approach fit together with all other aspects of the NPPF, which are more mooted about modal shift? So, for example, genuine choice doesn't say an attractive choice, and so on. Moving on from that second change that we noted is that to prioritize transport or sustainable transport versus appropriate opportunities. So the text now says sustainable transport modes are prioritized, taking into account the vision for the site, the type of development and its location. Now that would clearly appear to be stronger than what preceded it, but I suspect, like recognizing the beauty of the countryside under paragraph 187b, it used to be called 180b, it's likely to be subject to a reasonable, considerable debate and ultimately a question of judgment. Now, has this been sufficiently prioritized, taking into account all the considerations, and then ultimately this appears to be secondary to the vision? So the vision dictates what's to be achieved, and then you have prioritized taking into account that vision. Again, the explicit reference to type and location indicates that this provision is perhaps weaker than it initially suggests, and may not in fact function that differently from whether or not there have been appropriate opportunities for, let's say, public transport. The third change we identified, it reads that development should only be prevented or refused on transport grounds if there would be unacceptable impact on highway safety or the residual cumulative impact on the road network following mitigation would be severe. Now, taking into account all reasonable future scenarios, you got two things now added to it. That's much better improvement than the draft text, which was all tested scenarios and all about, if you look at the paperwork exercise. I suspect it would have led to a lot of debate about what would have been tested, and accordingly to whom, by whom, who's controlling it. And then you get also the word mitigation, and again I suspect it's not going to have that much material difference, since there was already a reference to residual impacts. So turning to that final phrase, all reasonable future scenarios, that's further clarified in the glossary, and that's entitled a range of realistic transport scenarios tested in agreement with the local planning authority and other relevant bodies, including statutory consultees, where appropriate, to assess potential impact and determine the optimum transport infrastructure required to mitigate any adverse impacts. Mouthful. Now, whether or not that requires approval from, say, the parish council, who may be concerned about the development or the site, or may be concerned about school runs, for example, that's their main focus. And the highway, and that might be more interest to them than the highway authority. And again, it's not 100% clear, but it's absolutely clear that's going to be much more inane arguments and discussions about what is realistic and what can be achieved. A couple of other changes in the glossary, and that's really hidden in plain sight, but these are support the vision-led approach. It says, a transport assessment is now a comprehensive and systematic process that considers that and sets out transport issues related to the proposed development in the context of the vision for the scheme. It identifies measures required to, and it removes improved accessibility and safety for motor vehicles, for motor travel, and replaces that with identifies measures required to support. That's going to be an interesting word and up for debate, of course, obviously. Support alternatives to cars such as walking, cycling and public transport. Not encourage alternatives, not nudge towards alternative, not prioritize alternatives, but support and to promote accessibility, together with measures that will be needed to deal with the anticipated transport impacts of the development. The other part has been added to travel plans, and that has section been updated, which again emphasizes that there's going to be an ongoing commitment. So a long-term management strategy for an organization or site that no longer seeks to deliver, but which has been removed, So a little bit more robust details how agreed sustainable transport objectives are to be delivered and is monitored and regularly reviewed. So again, emphasizing that this vision-led approach is not just for Christmas, but a long-term consideration that's going to have to be implemented, monitored, and adopted, and perhaps re-adopted. So clearly, all developments are going to have a vision. This is not just the status quo. It's not merely predict and provide. It's not just for Christmas or a New Year initiative. So the expected content of that vision is what's then up for debate. And it's not really clear, can the local plans identify what they would like to see in their vision-led plans? There's a great emphasis on securing and delivering the vision in the long term. However, now we have monitoring and adopting the vision-led plans as they confront reality is likely to give rise to interesting Section 106 agreements and conditions. Who should mitigate if the vision-led plans does not go to plan? Now, when we draft our travel plans, we typically say we will have an initial survey, we will have the first year survey, second year survey, and so on. And subject to those findings, we adopt the travel plans to meet the actual reality tested and measured model split. If you have that in Section 106, prior to even developing the development or prior to occupation or whatever the scenario is, what do you do then? What if the future residents stubbornly stick to their cars? You're doing all the initiatives, you're doing all the work, you're providing cycle parking, you're providing pools of parking, you're providing a pool car, everything you could possibly do, but residents still prefer to use a car. Well, so do we then need to take back some mitigation to say, well, if that doesn't happen, then we will need to do that. So it's all those issues and perhaps mitigations you originally proposed. For example, you may have provided some funding for public transport as part of your development, but people are not using public transport. What do you do then? Do you claw that money back? Do you use that money for something else? Have you lost that money? Interesting. So the weighing is towards a modal shift to be sustainable transport. However, it's not mandating car-free developments. It's not saying self-sustaining developments. And it's not providing or asking for restrictions on parkings or prohibiting the increases in congestion. So again, we need to provide, as developers, a genuine choice. And that's really the key points. So a couple of final thoughts, and this has to get together with the balanced approach, the key policies that directs development of sustainable locations, and the vision-led development. So if you notice in 155C, it references sustainable locations in the grey belt. Now, to me, this suggests that the vision-led approach or the visionary approach for a scheme can't be used as means of placing a development in a location that's not sustainable. Then finally, and unfortunately it may not be much relief, it's going to be really complicated for transport and it's not entirely clear. The consultation response very clearly says, in recognition of a large number of comments, which I suspect is an understatement, requesting further clarity and how these proposals would apply in practice. We will obviously keep you updated when we hear and we get any more information, but just to share with you some interesting experience, the vision-led approach we've been at iTransport Planning leading it for almost 15-20 years, very unfortunately in major overseas projects in Dubai, in Qatar, in Australia. Sadly, it hasn't filtered to the UK until this NPPF. We started it as the decide and provide approach was starting to emerge almost 2 years ago, and believe it or not, some highway authorities shot us in the foot because as we were trying to lead the industry into this new innovation, into this new culture, their consultants were trying to turn a vision-led approach into a paperwork exercise. Now, that's not what's really intended for developments. The intention is you look at this development, you decide on the best approach forward jointly. We start off as consultants with a starting point. The local authority shares their thoughts and we come with a scheme. What tends sadly to happen at times is that local authorities or their consultants feel that they've got the whip, they've got the upper hand, and therefore their vision is what determines how a development should go. I hope this is not going to be the case. I hope the previous experiences many consultants has been through are completely wrong, and this new December 2024 vision-led NPPF is going to see a new light for transport planning. Thank you so much for joining me, and if you have any queries, if you would like to get any more information, just feel free to contact me. Our portfolio on LinkedIn and the public media is available, and we're always there to support you. Make sure you've got the right consultant on your side. Make sure you've got a consultant who understands vision-led developments. Do not follow a paperwork exercise. That's not going to wash. It's going to take you down mazes of arguments and developments, agreements and disagreements. That's not what it should be. Thank you and see you soon.